The question the buyer is going to ask, what do I get when I buy this? And assuming that the employees are going to stay, are they happy here? Are your customers happy? Most of the folks we serve, they want to go faster, bigger, do something more interesting. If you find a narrow niche that you can be excellent in, that certainly makes the path a little bit easier towards selling a story and identifying who are you, what do you do, and why do clients love you. It's nerve-wracking. It's stressful, it's exhilarating, it's all of those things. And I know that when we do a transaction for a client, they'll remember it for the rest of their life.
Welcome to the Deep Specialization Podcast, the show where we blend focus, strategy, and client intimacy in order to scale and simplify our businesses and our lives. I'm your host, Corey Quinn. Let's jump into the show. I'm excited to welcome Todd Taskey to the podcast today. Todd is an investment banker with over 20 years of experience who specializes in advising agency founders and CEOs on how to maximize their value and achieve successful valuation and transactions. He's the CEO of Potomac Business Capital, and he's also the host of the Second Bite podcast.
All those things are true, Corey. Thank you for having me.
Super excited for you to be here. As I mentioned right before we hit record, the work that you do is super relevant, I think, for our audience, many of which are going to be agency founders and owners and CEOs who are eventually either in the short term or the longer term moving towards a transaction. And so you are one of the brand name experts in the agency space. You've been through a lot of major transactions. You've been helping those business owners through that. And so I'm super excited to have you here and to share your wisdom with the audience. So can you just introduce yourself a little bit more and just tell us about your business, Potomac Business Capital?
Yeah, thanks, Corey. I mean, I think you covered it pretty well. So a couple important things to mention. As you described, we do M&A transactions. We help founders that want to do a transaction with their business. Only represent sellers. So we never work for the buyer. Our clients are typically in a $1 million to $5 million of EBITDA range. And our clients are more focused on accelerating the growth of their business with a transaction than with selling to retire. So their hope is that they will get a chunk of cash at close and a chunk of equity upside in the larger company they acquire, in addition to perhaps a short earnout. And that's what we help people do and design.
That's beautiful. And I know that's related to the name of your podcast, the Second Bite podcast. Is that correct?
That is correct. So when you sell and you get cash at the beginning, that's your first bite. And then when the larger company sells, that becomes the second bite of the apple.
Yeah. I think you coin it as an evolutionary transaction where many business owners, specifically agency owners, consider this transaction as sort of selling the business and leaving, right? And walking away. Can you explain more about that transaction? What is the benefit of selling to a larger agency with an idea of having a second transaction down the road? Why take that approach?
So a great question. One, there's two things that people tend to conflate together that it makes a little bit inaccurate. A lot of people think about doing transactions and they call it a roll up, right? If you're in the SEO business and I buy another SEO company and another one, and have a bigger SEO company, the whole thing will be worth more because the EBITDA is larger. And that may be true, but where buyers have created real value is in creating what they would call an arc of services, where if you are an SEO shop, you'll acquire maybe a paid, maybe social, maybe email, maybe content, and stitch these together in a full offering so that you can provide greater service, more wallet share to a client. And so from that perspective, clients that want to grow their business, most of your listeners, one way to do that is to expand their offering. And the notion that they're going to be as good in a secondary or a tertiary offering as they are in their core offering, most folks are intimidated by that. So what they look to do is to put together capability sets so that they can become that kind of full service offering, if you will. Or what we've seen more recently is, and I know you've had some of them on your podcast, people that are focused in a vertical and they provide marketing services in a vertical. And so we did a transaction with a guest you've had on, Mike Perez at iLawyer Marketing. It was sold to Everservice, which is owned by Sunstone Partners, and they're a large and successful private equity group. And their thesis is that they wanted to be in home services, they want to be in legal services, and they want to be in medical services, elective medical. So they bought a company called Blue Corona. They bought some smaller companies to go along with that. They acquired iLawyer Marketing, and they'll acquire others to build out that offering and be a sizable business, and will likely do a transaction, if I were to guess, in the next year or two. So how you're going to go about doing that is you're either going to keep your net worth at risk for a long period of time and compete against very well funded private equity groups, or you're going to become a part of one of those and play an important and significant role in the future success of that business.
Super interesting. And I've got 1,000 questions spinning around my head. I'm thinking in the role of the seller is one of the more basic benefits of doing this is that they'll get a greater total sort of payout or, benefit at the end of the day as a result of taking this sort of more of an evolutionary transaction versus if they just tried to find an acquirer who was looking to buy them out and they walk away. Or does that even exist?
It doesn't exist where they just walk away. In a service business, you should expect you're going to get a year or 2 years of an earnout. And most of the folks that that you have on your show are not interested in being an employee. And that's not really what our focus is. Most of the folks we serve, they want to go faster, be bigger, do something more interesting now that they've gotten to a certain level of success. And so, that's what we help them do is find those opportunities. We've got a company here that used to be called Social SEO, and we did a transaction for them in 2019, Thanksgiving week of 2019. And they were about $2 million of EBITDA at that time. They were acquired by a great private equity group called Everlane Capital, very good private equity group in Boston. Those guys finished last year, I think, around 16 million of EBITDA. So they went from 2 to 16 in about 5 years.
And what do you attribute that
And
to?
well, first of all, they acquired 3 or 4 businesses in there. They were largely in the SEO space. They acquired a paid agency. They acquired a social agency. They acquired an Amazon agency. They had much more money to invest in sales and marketing efforts and just everything that comes along with a successful business. And they got a good chunk of cash at close. Their roll forward is probably going to be worth 4 or 5 times as much as the cash they got at close. And they've been having a great time growing a business of the size that I mentioned.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. I know that there can be some artificial ceilings for agencies that have gotten to that 2 to 3, maybe 1 to 2 EBITDA, and that by taking this type of transaction, it could give them access to a lot more capital, different types of that's people and whatnot. I've heard you say that a successful transaction is really solving 2 problems. One is money, and the other is a quote fill in the blank problem.
Yeah,
When you
yeah.
consider the agency owners, what are some of the typical fill in the blank problems that they may be facing when, and looking to solve?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And everybody listening to this right now knows what that fill in the blank is for them. But I'll give you a couple of examples and ones that are most current. We did a transaction a couple years ago, a company called Sproutword. And Sproutword is an agency, but they have a great direct to consumer data platform. Kevin Biondi, and if you want to listen to him, he was on our podcast at secondbikepodcast.com. If you want to listen to him, he'll tell you when we did that transaction, which was a couple years ago, he said, we have maybe one of the best data platforms in the market. And it allows large D2C brands to ingest their own first-party data and to buy media more effectively. So let's say we have the best that's out there. Next year, man, it's going to be pretty good. And the year after that, it's going to be the same thing everybody else has. Unless we pump a lot of money in there to keep it current, to add features and blah, and that is expensive. You know what makes it really expensive? Using my money to do that. That's brutal. So they did a transaction. We sold them. They got a bunch of cash. There's 3 founders there. One of them is the second to the CTO. One of them's driving their private equity business, and Kevin's doing his thing. So that's been a great thing. We did a transaction last year. We sold a company called Endra to Power Digital. Power Digital has been a huge success story, great business. My guy, Ned McPherson, he does conversion rate optimization. As he told me, every time I get in front of somebody, every time we close that deal. They're really good at CRO. It just takes me forever to get in front of somebody. You know why? I don't have a relationship. I don't have a sales team. And I'm a sub $10 million agency in Miami, Florida. Power Digital has 200 e-commerce clients. They have a sales team of 7 or 8 people that not will make sales. They have existing relationships. I talked to Ned maybe a month ago. We're strolling into these calls and people are like, geez, that's fantastic. How do we get started? And we're just knocking them over. It's unbelievable. So for a lot of guys, the fill in the blank is sales, or I need more of a balance sheet, or I can't get my utilization right because we hire a guy and my EBITDA goes down and I'm not using it. And then we bring in a couple new clients and now my team is stressed. And that's hard when you're small, right? So from that perspective, that's what the solve is. And so when you take an entrepreneur and you say, here's a bunch of cash, here's a big chunk of equity. So and it's the same equity everybody else has. The private equity guys, the founders, everybody has the same equity you have. You plug into our finance, you plug into our HR, you plug into our sales team, whatever it is. When you can find that kind of fit, people are motivated to do a transaction, and it creates a much better outcome for everybody involved.
Yeah. I think of the theory of constraints, where if you have an amazing product, you have the ability to provide a lot of value in the marketplace, but you just don't have the capacity or the skill set to build a sales team. Going this direction, I think, makes a lot of sense.
I had a call with a guy, a couple months ago. There's a guy that I've known for a long time. He's like, how is some of your clients are growing so rapidly? How do you do that? I said, I'll tell you exactly how. Now, he's got there's 2 of them. Their EBITDA is about $2 million a year. I said, you got to take $500,000 of that and apply it to a sales organization over the next year and hope it works.
Right. Hope.
He's like, I'm not going to do that. I said, obviously you haven't done it in the 7 years, 8 years you've been in business. That's the difference between somebody growing at 20 or 30% or somebody not. You know what I hear all the time from entrepreneurs? Next year, we're going to hire a sales guy. In the history of private equity, they've never said that. Private equity builds a sales function. That's 3 salespeople and a manager. That's what that is. That's $500,000. And I know out of those 3 salespeople, probably one's going to stay on board. And then gradually I'll have a sales force.
Right.
And then we'll just go from there.
Most founders, even if they have $500,000, plugged away, they're probably not thinking about how quickly they can spend it on a sales team.
My God, it's coming out of my own pocket. That's hard to do. Private equity, it's not coming out of their pocket. It's just how we grow businesses. But that's why it works so well for them.
I think it is ironic a little bit that these are the same businesses that are asking their clients to spend money to advertise their own
Yeah,
money.
yeah. And by the way, just so you know, if you're doing a million, 2 million of EBITDA and you're growing at 15% a year, you are a winner at the game of life. You've got you've employed 50 or 70 people. You've got great clients. I know something could be better, something could always be better, but just because we're talking about this doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. It's just another way. But one thing I hear all the time, Corey, is I didn't know you could do this. I thought if I sold my business, I had to do a 2-year earn out and then I leave. Right?
Exactly. So, in the terms of the mindset of preparing for a transaction, you talk about the importance of running a good business. What are some important metrics that an agency should be doing in preparation for this type of transaction?
The the metrics that you're going to be judged on are retention and the percentage of your revenue that's recurring and your growth rate to a lesser degree. But if your retention is a key factor, and if your retention is in that 90%, 88% range, you're doing great. One thing we don't put in any of our decks when you put a PowerPoint together and you talk about the company, we never have a page on culture because everybody blabbers about cultures, this, that, and the other thing. We put the executive team and how long they've been here. That's culture, right? If your executive team of 6 or 5 or 8 people has been with you for an average of 1 or 2 years, that tells me a lot about culture. If they've been there 7 or 8 or 10 years, that tells me a lot about culture, right? The two biggest ones are going to be your retention and how much of your revenue is recurring.
You mentioned executive retention. What about just overall employee retention? Is that ever a determining factor or is that just an additive data point?
It's interesting. It goes to cultures. For that reason, it's important. In the digital marketing space, a lot of times you'll hire younger people, and younger people are trying to figure out their way in the world. So somebody will pay them a little bit more and they'll go somewhere else. If the employee turnover is high or your Glassdoor rating is low, people will pick up on that and they'll want an intelligent answer for why that is.
I imagine a lot of people who inquire with you are not quite ready for a transaction. What are some of the key indicators or milestones that agency owners should look at to determine if they're truly ready for a transaction?
Geez, that's a good question. So if you're, I would say this, if you're over $1 million of EBITDA, I think the opportunity is available to you. The question becomes, what's the value of the business and what's the potential fit and the rest? It's interesting because I did a transaction a couple years ago with a company called Worth e-commerce, and they do email marketing for e-commerce customers only. And they were right about 1 million, actually a little bit under 1 million of EBITDA. But they were like this nice, neat little box, and it was an easy story to tell. And we got a great transaction for them. We sold them a company called SmartBug a couple years ago. Then I had another company out west. They're like 2.5 million of EBITDA. Then they do SEO work. I was like, Jesus, guys, you're right in the middle of the fairway for us. It's right down the, no problem. We'll get it. And it was hard, very hard to find a transaction for them. And what I learned was, because it surprised me, a lot of the buyers said, so what do? They do SEO? Well, we do SEO. How big are they? They're about 2.4 million. Eh, I mean, it kind of doesn't move the needle a lot. And, if I'm going to pay 6 times for that, it's what, 15-ish million bucks. And I don't get anything new for that. I don't get right there. I mean, they have some great clients and blah, blah, blah. We eventually, when you start to form your targets, there's the bullseye, and then you get tangential circles outside of that. So we found like on the third circle, it was a translation business, a data translation business. And so they felt like they wanted to be able to offer some marketing services to their customers. So that's how that thing came about. So I guess that's how I would kind of answer that, if that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, it's Corey. I wanted to take a quick break from the show to say that if you're an agency owner looking for a strategic and reliable white label partner, you should check out E2M. They offer website design, WordPress development, e-commerce solutions, SEO, PPC, and content writing. And they are trusted by over 300 agencies. You can check out E2M's transparent and flexible pricing model at e2msolutions.com/the Deep Specialization Podcast. For limited time, E2M is offering a special 20% discount for the Deep Specialization Podcast listeners on your first month. Go check them out. Now back to the show. Having a specific skill set that maybe is more unique and could potentially attract buyers more quickly than if you are just the typical SEO agency.
Well, I think otherwise you just need to be larger, right? And this goes to part of the story. Hey, who are you? What do you do? And why do clients love you? And feels like more and more the question is, who are the people that love you? We sold 2 businesses last year that were both in the legal vertical. We have a client under LOI now that's in the elective medical vertical. We have one that's in the home services vertical. We have another client that is in the Amazon ecosystem, and they provide marketing services on the Amazon platform. All of those, it used to be, geez, this is a digital marketing agency, right? You got to go back 5 or 6 years for that. Like Power Digital, who's great in a whole bunch of things, didn't feel like they were good in that niche of CRO, which is the reason why they were interested in Enron. If you find a narrow niche that you can be excellent in, that probably it certainly makes the path a little bit easier towards selling a story and identifying somebody that wants that narrow capability set. Probably makes it easier to tell your story to future customers as well.
If you had 2 agencies where they had, let's say they both had $2 million of EBITDA, they both provided similar types of services for businesses. One was more of a generalist. They targeted small, medium-sized businesses. And the other one targeted just one vertical market. They had similar EBITDA, as I said, similar retention, similar tenure from executives, all else being equal. Is one going to be valued more, generally speaking, in the market than the other because they're either a generalist or they are a vertical specialist?
It's a great question. If this were at the beginning of 2025, there would be a market for both of those for sure. It would be a little bit more of a direct market for the ones as vertical specialists, as opposed to, let's say, an SMB. But you just approach the market a little bit differently. In that specific example, there's a bunch of folks that do SMB marketing. So it'd be a little bit harder to get the valuation that I would like. Whereas let's just take legal, since you've had people on your podcast and we've sold a couple of them. That's a vertical that people really like. The elective medical business, those guys were a scratch over $1 million of EBITDA. It took me a month to find 3 offers for that business. And we got a great buyer for them, and they're in due diligence. That'll close next month. So anything that is really verticalized and there's not a lot of others that are either available at the time or in that space is nice.
Why do you think that is?
Just because it's something I can get and understand. For example, that buyer is private equity backed, focused on dentistry and elective medical. My guy does the majority in plastics and then a little bit in LASIK. And they're like, oh, geez, man, LASIK, we're not doing that. That would be great for our book because we plan on selling next year in 26, right? So it's just a matter of when you find the right fit, then you can lean into getting the type of valuation that you're looking for.
I've heard you say when you work with a client, you want to, in some respects, discount their vision. Can you explain why you take this approach and what should a business owner expect as they go through this process? Or more specifically, what is the value of the process?
Great question. It's interesting because we had a client who's coming on. We're going to record a podcast next week. And he said, this was the greatest experience I've had. I understand my business so much better. Here's how we're growing it. All the stuff he learned from going through the process. So this is what I tell people. When you go through a process, you're going to talk to a bunch of very smart people that know your space, know this industry, and do not care about your feeling. And the only reason you won't do a transaction is because of value. If you don't get the value you want, you'll hear it over and over and over again. They'll say, Corey, listen, man, you do too much of this for us and you don't do enough of that. And then what happens is you look in the mirror and you're like, I have a specific diagnosis to what makes my company more valuable. And now for the next 2 years, I'm going to work on this, that, and the other thing because the market has told me this will create more value. Or you look at yourself or you talk to your partner and you realize this, that, and the other thing. Do you have any idea how difficult that is to get that right? And so when you get such clarity by going through the process, that it is like a master class in how to run your specific business that you can't get. It's like the greatest consulting you could get.
It makes it all very real, right? You get to understand what the market really is and what people
Well,
want.
I have one client today. We started the process 18 months ago. He didn't get what he wanted. And what he learned was, I need to have a sales function. He's got 4 salespeople today and a sales manager. Their revenue is up. His EBITDA went from like a million eight-ish. They're about 3 now in 2 years. And it's just humming along. And we'll go back to a process in the spring of this year, and he'll get much more than he thought. But he became so convicted about spending money on marketing because he had heard it over and over and over. We interviewed and we got offers from 4 different private equity groups, and they were all going to do the same thing. Very simple. Not easy, but simple.
So you mentioned obviously company financials are really important. They have to be rock solid for a deal to actually go through. What are some typical or common financial mistakes you see agency owners make that actually can jeopardize a transaction?
Yeah. So we don't do it anymore. When somebody comes on as a client, we bring in a CFO and go through their financials in the way that a private equity group will. Has to be accrued for properly. You have to be on accrual, not cash. Doesn't mean you have to change anything about your business or the way you file taxes, but you have to be GAAP compliant, which means you have to be accrued for properly. The number one reason why deals shift is because the buyer comes in and does quality of earnings. And quality of earnings is to make sure that they're reporting it right. And maybe it's a little bit of, maybe we can get the EBITDA down a little bit because of different things, right? One example, we've done plenty of deals where our client has 30 or 50 people offshore in a low cost center, but they're not employees. A private equity group has to make them employees because that's consistent with local law and US law. That means there's got to be benefits paid. There's got to be other stuff that's going to drive up the cost. We've got one group with that right now, and we're out in front of it. And we've told them, you got to make this adjustment in, then it was about 200 grand out of a $5-ish million EBITDA business. So we told them that up front. They're like, oh, no, that's not a problem for us. We understand, blah, blah, blah. And I've had it in many cases where you get through due diligence and like, geez, man, there's a couple hundred extra. We didn't expect it. We got to adjust the EBITDA down by a couple hundred grand. And that's completely factual and completely true. Sometimes you can mitigate that in advance when there's a real competition for the company. But if you're surprised by at the end, after you've signed an LOI, there's no way to recover. So you've got to have really good financials. Part of our engagement fee we spend on a finance team to go through it and make sure that it's accurately reported.
I can imagine because you probably have eyes and just your background, you and your team's background can be able to help bring the agency owner along, see these things maybe in a way that's different than what they were expecting before they get into these
We have
conversations.
a client right now under LOI, and there was a special situation. He's like, listen, we haven't prepared our books for a transaction. We would have run the business differently. Said, okay, well, how so? And we went through all of those components and we added them all back to EBITDA. Most buyers at this size understand They're not expecting your financials to be perfect, but we need to understand them well enough to describe those to a buyer so they understand. Yeah, I did a transaction last year where my client is homeschooling their children. The teacher is an employee of the company. Okay, well, we're not going to do that after close. So we're adding it back, and the car and the travel and all the stuff, right? Buyers are fine with that. They understand the way the world works. We just want to make sure that we're reporting it all properly.
You mentioned that this specific case, they would have run the business differently. Is there any kind of universal truths that agencies should be aware of as it relates to running the business to set themselves up for not being surprised?
It is, I use the expression getting skinny for the wedding. Buyers have seen it, right? You went from 5 customer success managers to 3. How come? They're overworked. Their utilization rate is through the roof. I mean, it's stuff like this. Private equity is like, well, or whoever the buyer is, buyers are really smart people. And they're going to get literally into that level of granularity and due diligence. Last year in January, you had 5 customer success people. You only have 3 today. How come? Because when I see your EBITDA is up, part of that's due to growth, but part of it is due, even though you're growing, your COGS, your SG&A is down. You used to have 4 salespeople, now you have 2. I mean, you're not going to fool anybody. So there is no preparing for you. Say, here is a great company. We are doing great stuff for wonderful clients. That's what people value.
I noticed you mentioned at the beginning that you are seller, you represent the seller only. Why have you set your business up like that? Why is that important?
I enjoy working with sellers. As people always will question, if you work for a seller and the buyer, are you ever skewed that maybe you're going to, you're friendly with this buyer or blah, blah, anything like that. So I don't avoid that conversation. We always and only represent the seller. And, that's just our view of the world.
What would be your parting advice, particularly for an agency owner who is interested, let's say, in a 3-year time frame? What are the things they should be doing today to prepare for a transaction, let's say 3 years down the road?
So I'll give a little bit of a plug. The best answer to that is listen to other agency owners that have been down that road. And that's who we try to talk to on the Second Bite podcast. So you can go listen to some people there. The question the buyer is going to ask, what do I get when I buy this? And I'm assuming that the employees are going to stay. Are they happy here? Are your customers happy? What's your retention? What's the likelihood that they'll retain? And is the revenue recurring? So those should be all the things that you should focus on. And all of that is hard to do and do well, right? And I think it starts from having good people that are happy. Good, happy employees make good, happy customers. And that makes a good, happy P&L and then a balance sheet and everything else. So always just grow a good business. And that's the best way to prepare yourself for some type of a transaction.
Thank you. Last question. What's your motivation?
Mine personally, working with sellers, working with founders that have built something from nothing and help them monetize that and get money in their pocket and everything else. That's great. Helping them fulfill a vision. It's a great superpower to have, if you will. It is a ton of fun. It's nerve-wracking. It's stressful. It's exhilarating. It's all of those things. And I know that when we do a transaction for a client, they'll remember it for the rest of their life. And to play a role in that with an entrepreneur that has really built something is, the greatest career fulfillment I could imagine. So I love the work.
We didn't get a chance to mention it previously, but I know that you're very relationship focused. And what you just shared reinforces that. It's not about the transaction. It's ultimately about the relationship. So.
Well, I mean, transactions are so hard to get done. And when you can get one accomplished, and it starts from way at the beginning, right? We don't get people retrading on our deals because they realize, the buyers do, how difficult it was for them to be selected as the buyer. And they know that either because they've gone through a process or we've got a process coming if they don't. That Amazon company I mentioned to you, we're talking to 3 groups right now, and we're going to do a process in May. So we're going to run a full process and go to market in May. Because of the relationship, I'm taking it to 3 groups that I know really want to be in Amazon. And I know those guys fit my client's objective really well because he wants to get some money, but he wants to be the president of Amazon for a bigger business. And these 3, the personalities fit, their desires for growth fit, the way they treat their customers, all that stuff fits. So if you make an offer and you shift on your offer, then we'll just go to market in May.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We're not desperate to do a deal. Please don't F it up. Right?
Not paying the wanting it tax, right? No desperation, no commission breath.
Exactly. Correct.
Beautiful. Thanks, Todd. So where can people reach out to you in addition to listening to your Second Bite podcast? Where can people find you, reach out, connect?
Yeah, the easier, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can see my name here on the video. Taskey is my last name. You can go to Second Bite Podcast. That is attached to our website. So you can track me down there. And if you really get stuck, you can reach out to Corey and say, hey, how do I get Todd's email? And I'm sure he'll give it to you, but it's Todd@PotomacBusinessCapital.com.
Todd, thank you so much for joining. This has been great.
Corey, it's a great conversation. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for tuning in to the Deep Specialization Podcast. If you haven't checked out my best-selling book, Anyone, Not Everyone, you can download the audiobook for free right now by going to anyoneNotEveryone.com. That's anyoneNotEveryone.com. And finally, a special thank you to our sponsor, E2M. We'll see you in the next episode.